Hello, hello, hello. Welcome back to another episode of Ryantist Scientist. Today, we are going to be speaking with my friend Peter, and we are going to be talking about the combative and often turbulent relationship between nature and infrastructure, human infrastructure. And my friend Peter, he has a background in environmental studies and urban planning. And in his experience out there in the world doing the work, he has had a plethora of experiences that all have this kind of common theme of the often violent interaction between nature and human infrastructure. And so we're looking at invasive species and how they're super disruptive to our systems and processes, climate change and how that's messing with some of our infrastructure and how we may or may not be ready for it, but we're working in the direction of and starting to make some improvements maybe. And we also talk about flooding, drainage, and how changes to precipitation are starting to make some moves. We also talk about urban farming, and that's the environment of urban centers and how humans interact with those things can be some human-born challenges on top of some other challenges to amp up and increase the amount of urban agriculture in cities in the United States. So without further ado, let's just dive right into this and talk a little bit more about nature, infrastructure with Peter Rathsack. How's marathon training?
Things are good. Half marathon. Only half marathon.
How's half marathon training?
It's good.
Don't give yourself too much credit.
Not a full. It's good. Having fun. I'm going to run a race in Central Park in December. That'll be nice.
Ooh, hopefully it's not nice and chilly.
Yeah. That's really it. I'm going back to Michigan for a weekend, next weekend, for a wedding.
Excellent.
Mm-hmm.
Whose wedding?
Oh, like a family friend. We grew up together. It should be fun. And I'm just looking forward to hanging out with my family, obviously. I don't see them a ton. So.
And getting the hell out of Dodge.
Getting out of Dodge, it's always nice to go out of the city. We're going camping again in October sometime.
Are you ready?
Yeah, should we get on track?
Yeah, I mean, this is part of being on track.
So you want me to talk about myself?
Yeah, so that's okay. So, ready? Here we go. So this is probably the most difficult question that you'll be asked. Okay. The most invoking of existential dread.
Oh, no.
Who is Peter?
Oh, no.
Yeah.
I'm really glad that we only have to talk about the, environmentalist, ecological, nature loving side of who is Peter and not, the whole rest of my baggage. So it's nice to keep it to that.
Yeah.
Who am I? I'm just
Who is Peter?
I'm just a man.
Where is he from? What's he doing?
He grew up.
What's his life about?
Michigan. He grew up in Michigan. Southern Michigan. So farm fields, a lot of farmland. But it was good. I mean, it was a cool place to grow up in some sense, for sure. We had a lot of room to run around and play and be outside. And my neighbor behind us owned an old farmhouse, and she had a couple acres of wooded area and grassland kind of stuff. So we'd run around back there and build forts and just look at bugs. And there was a pond back. One winter we went out on the pond in the ice and we were oh, and then we never did that again. That's a tragic story. So that was, that was cool. And I spent a lot of time outside. My parents, I feel really lucky that they put a lot of priority on we didn't travel like some people do, like all over the country, but like within our like radius of the state and neighboring states, like we would drive a lot. And so we'd go to like state parks, national parks that were like close by. And that was like really important to them to like get us out and everything. And so that was like my early, like, I don't think I realized how lucky I was until I like look back on it. And I'm like, I got exposed to like lots of cool stuff, like pretty young. And then my family also has a place up in like northern Michigan. So we'd get to go up there in the summers and like hang out on the lake and like, you know, go in the woods and stuff. So like still just like such great exposure at a young age to like being outside in nature and not, and just like kind of building like a foundation for like understanding it more as you get older, but like having like a solid base as a kid, just like getting to run around and stuff. So yeah, definitely like a lot of outside time as a kid. And then I like in high school, I remember taking AP environmental science and it was just like, wow, like I didn't know that like you could actually like go to school for this kind of thing, like study this, you know? And it was like eye opening. I was like, this is it. Like, I love this kind of stuff. And I never like, I didn't love school, but like that was like a class that I was like, this is awesome. Like, I really enjoyed this. So then went to college, went to University of Toledo, studied the environment, studied urban planning. Worked on an urban farm while I was there for a little bit. That was really cool.
Really?
Yeah. Yep. It was cool. It was in like a little tougher part of town for sure, and like an urban food desert. And so it was like I worked with this guy named Thomas, and he lived there, he grew up there, and he was taking vacant lots and like clearing them, and then putting like garden beds on them. And the soil was super contaminated from all the like manufacturing and industrial stuff going on there. So I worked into like, you know, coffee grounds and compost and like turn these beds into like, you had to raise them because you couldn't grow in this like native soil that was there. So yeah, I mean, we grew a bunch of vegetables. It was actually, you can, if you're ever bored or if someone listening is interested, you can Google Thomas Jackson. There's some stories about him because his neighbor was like complaining about it. Like they were saying like his like compost piles and like what he was doing was like attracting rodents. But like if you were to like, even if you look on Google Earth or if you were to like drive down the neighborhood, like you're just kind of cruising along in this neighborhood. And then, you know, there's a vacant lot here or there and like a little bit disrepair. And then you'd like turn the corner and see his plot. And it's like just okra and like, you know, watermelon and these like plots that have been
like a legit, all of a sudden there's a farm.
Yeah. And you're like, oh my God, this is amazing. And like, who isn't willing to live with like maybe a rat or two, you know, that's like setting up shop in a compost pile. Like you can deal with that to like completely revitalize and change your neighborhood. Like there are solutions to that, and it's worth always like doing that kind of thing. I think
there's always that one guy. There's always the one.
Yeah, it was one person. Everyone else in the neighborhood was like coming, and he'd like sell produce to everyone. And like, you know, if you didn't have a car, like there was nothing in walking distance. So it was like literally a urban organic farm. Like you could just go and buy his stuff, like no problem. So he had to go to court and like it went far. It went far, and like it kept getting pushed up, and like eventually like obviously everything was dropped and he didn't have to pay any of the fines or anything. But like the fact that he even had to go there was like kind of ridiculous. Because like I said, like if you just like were to look at the area, you would say like you'd be willing to put up with like a lot to have this revival done, right? Like I would be willing to have like dinosaurs walking around or something. To have, you know, a farm in my backyard. Like, I don't know. but yeah, it was a cool experience. He's a really cool guy and like a fighter. Like was not gonna be like
Yeah.
couldn't do that. So yeah, check him out, Thomas Jackson. He's a good guy. So yeah, did that in college. Graduated December of 2019. Had big plans to go do a little backpacking in Spain, and then pandemic hit, and I was like, oh man, what am I gonna do? Like, fresh out of college, no real plan. I luckily found a job with the within the Water Resource Department, specifically the Drain Commission, and it was pretty like it was an interesting and fun job. I mean, it was a lot of like getting chainsaws out and like, driving trucks and tractors and doing a lot of like pretty tough, like boots on the ground work. Like it was very physical.
Yeah. And this is in Toledo, in Ohio?
Sorry, this is back in Michigan. So I moved home because I've graduated. So this is like in Washtenaw County, which you're not familiar, maybe someone listening is, but like Ann Arbor, Ypsilanti are like cities, more like, and then there's like a couple neighboring communities that's like pretty rural. So it has like an interesting mix. So like one day I would be out working on like some urban infrastructure, right? Like patching, like storm drains or like clearing them, and then like another day I'd be like in a farm field putting in a pipe for like a farm tile or like walking a drainage ditch. And like it was a nice variety. And it was a lot of fun, and it was cool, like to be involved in that kind of thing. But it also like really got me thinking. I think I still have the like note in my phone somewhere where I like jotted down like I think it was something like the relationship between like nature and infrastructure, and just how like clashing it is at all times, and like this extensive network of like man-made drainage like within a natural environment, and like trying to balance all of that. And it was like
Was this like drainage the way that I'm like gray infrastructure drainage, or is it like a mixture of like ditches that are just guiding water as drainage, or is it just like storm drains and like underground concrete and like metal tubes?
So it's both, right? So in Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti, like Ypsilanti is pretty like they had a lot of manufacturing, and like that's a developed area with definitely like concrete pipes running underneath, the streets and grates and drains. And then it's also like fields that were once, wetlands, or at least wetter areas that have been drained and they're diverted through these, agricultural ditches. And then even like the rivers and the creeks that you would look at and be like, that's just a river, and or a creek in like someone's backyard. It's really like some of them aren't even, they are called drains. They are like the Swan Creek drain, for example. So it's like
they were created for the purpose of drainage.
Yes, or at least something existed that was carrying water, but it was manipulated to be better at it. And like it's maintained for that purpose. So a lot of my job was that maintenance of like a tree fell. And like it was really hard because sometimes a tree would go down, and you could tell it had been there a long time, and it had like diverted the water, and it had created like its own little ecosystem, right? Where it like, because of the movement of the water, had dug it deeper, and you have like, kind of like wetter areas on the edges. And so you've got like you would see different, like you'd see frogs there, or like different species living there. And we would have to go in and just remove the log and like return flow to its normal, like, return the river. Yeah. So the same, it was like heartbreaking at times. And that's when I do my like notes, and in my head, like thinking like, this is like, it's just so hard, like the clash between nature and infrastructure, because like we need drainage. We can't have people's backyards being flooded, but we're also destroying like the natural order of things, right? So like it was definitely tough, and I researched and looked into like different ways of doing things, because there are some areas in the country where it's very like they're very progressive, and they try and manage things in a way that takes both into account, but it's hard to it's time consuming, and it's difficult to do that. So
Yeah. I'm super interested by this whole like idea because thinking about it from my perspective, like I've been in this kind of super concrete,
mhm,
like everything is artificial
right,
environment for my whole life that what's like the most interesting to me about what you're talking about is that that conflict. I don't think that me or people like me ever experience like those kinds of conflicted emotions about
yeah,
returning something to an artificial state when it's surrounded entirely by like artificial environment.
yeah,
That like I can think of a million things that I've seen and like decisions be made that come from a place of like, well, why the hell would you do that? And it's like I would wonder if decision making like is influenced by that same thing of just like not ever having that moment of seeing like a little frog environment that was created by accident that you have to like destroy, because
right.
here it would just be like a mosquito swell I guess, and like dank gray New York City water that just like is stagnant, and
Yeah,
like everyone would want that to get like fixed, or like in the park, just like giant huge puddles that just are there for
yeah,
forever and become like mosquito borne issues. And like it's that part of it I don't really have that much experience like dealing with, so that's like an interesting like thought
yeah.
to be like,
No,
huh,
and that's an
like
interesting
what a
perspective.
what a unique thing to
Yeah,
me.
yeah, very different like lenses of how you kind of look at
Yeah.
it, because like you said, it's a concrete built environment. I have a specific memory of one time we were ripping out, and it's like brutal, right? Like you've got this big tractor making all this noise and like a chain wrapped around a log, and it's pulling, and these field mice just come like pouring out of
Uh,
like wherever they were living, and a couple of them were like falling in the water, and so I like run across the creek to like try and save them, and I step on a log, and there's nothing but water under the log, and I just fall into the creek, and I'm like scampering up the side trying to save these mice. But yeah, I mean it's interesting, like you said, your perspective is different, having it not be it's like a little bit removed when you're not like when it was concrete from the not from the beginning, but for you it
yeah.
yeah.
So you did this, and then from there you were involved in like in AmeriCorps. I remember you telling me,
Yeah, so
right?
yeah, drain
And this
commission.
is more like water related stuff.
Yeah, definitely. So drain commission, um, and then did that for a year. So I started in the summer, and the
Mm.
following spring, I was accepted into a AmeriCorps program um, in New Hampshire, which I knew nothing about New Hampshire. I did not realize it bordered Canada. I don't know, like I'm just an idiot, but I moved. I moved to New Hampshire and did an AmeriCorps program there, and it was an awesome experience. Like I think if it's the right, like I think everyone should do AmeriCorps if they get the opportunity and they have the ability to, and it's the right. They feel like it's the right program for them. Because I know a lot of people have different experiences, but mine was really good, and yeah, we did a lot of different stuff there. So we were on Squam Lake, which is a big lake. I think I can't remember the miles around, but it's big and it's pretty deep. I think it's 100 feet deep at some spots. We had a lot of different responsibilities at Squam Lake, and one of them included like invasive species removal. And to do that, we would scuba dive, um, which was awesome and really fun. I had not dove before then. So essentially, you kind of just like get a bag and get all your dive stuff on and go down there. We're removing Eurasian and variable milfoil. Um, and it's this like spirally long plant, and I mean, it's essentially like weeding underwater, really. Like you just kind of make sure you get all the roots out, shove it in the bag, kind of fill up your bag, swim around. It gets super like all of the, if you think about like when you're weeding above ground at the surface, and like there's a lot of dirt, right? And like you're shaking the roots out to like get the dirt out. Like all of that when you're underwater is just like getting kicked up in the water. So like it's really hard to see at times. So you're kind of like moving around these patches and like weeding and so yeah, it was really fun. Definitely challenging at times. We also had a it was like a vacuum, so it was a pump on a pontoon boat that would essentially like suck up any material that you like put in front of it. So instead of carrying a bag around, you could like pull it and like put it in this tube, and it would send it to the surface. It was really efficient. It was a little bit like more difficult to control, and you obviously want to be mindful of the ecosystem that's there, right? So you don't want to like disturb it too much. But Eurasian milfoil it's an aggressive plant. So it'll take over an area quickly, spreads by sea, but also by fragmentation. So like a lake like that, where there's a lot of recreation, you get a lot of people moving around and like boat propellers and, kayakers, maybe like just like cutting the plants, running into them, like breaking off pieces, and then they just float and eventually sink and like sprout back in and grow. Yeah, so pretty pesky. Definitely like can take over an area quickly. The program I was involved in has been there a long time, so they've made a lot of like progress. And it's definitely superior to like putting herbicides in the water. I don't think anyone should be doing that.
That sounds like a crazy idea.
Yeah, I'm sure there's proponents, people who think that it's a good idea and you can do it effectively, but to me, it seems like those two things don't really mix. So
yeah. Well, like, what was like the goal of? So you were doing this with the goal of like removing invasive species. Like, why was it a problem that the invasive species were in like this lake particularly? Like, what was it doing that needed to be undone?
Well, I mean, it outcompetes native plants, right? And any organisms living in that ecosystem rely on those plants, and the state in which the ecosystem is, meant to be in, they all kind of rely on that to live and sustain. So introduction of invasive species like that can really like shake things up and cause like a cascading event, throughout food webs in the ecosystem there.
So like it could get like everywhere, like all the water that's like connected from that lake.
Yeah, I mean,
like theoretically it could end up like all the places that water flows to.
Definitely. I mean, it's got to be the right conditions. So I think I don't know that area like well enough to, like, I've never canoed all the way down the river, but if you were to, you might eventually hit a place where the creek gets really shallow or something, and like there might be a natural barrier that would make it a lot more difficult for it to advance any further. But at that point too, like anyone recreating in that area, if it expands its range, that expands the amount of people who now can pick it up and take it somewhere else. So keeping it contained in an area and having one lake where like we know it's here, like we're gonna have, another part of our job was to go to boat launches and kind of talk about, like clean, drain, dry, which is like clean off your boat, drain any ballast water, dry it off, make sure you're not carrying any critters with you and taking it somewhere else. So if you can contain that within one body of water, it definitely makes the fight easier, for sure.
So this like in invasive species, like in this particular, or like in any water, like it impacts, like it's one of the many things that impacts the quality of the water, or like the way that it moves, or like
well, let me talk about another one, because I feel like zebra mussels are like a really good example of how like one organism can have pretty significant impacts. Now, milfoil definitely does, and it's a problem. Zebra mussels are
like mollusks,
right?
Like
little... They're mollusks. Yeah, it's a fun word to say too. they came in like the ballast water of shipping boats or not containers, but shipping vessels in the Great Lakes. So they're filter feeders. So and they're what's the problem? Invasives are really good at what they do, and that's why they're in an area, right? Because they're way better at surviving. So like zebra mussels can filter water like way more efficiently. So in the Hudson River, in 2 to 4 days, they can cycle through all of the water in the Hudson River. Before they were present, it would take the native mussels 2 to 3 months. So that's like a huge difference, right?
You said 2 to 3 days versus 2 to 3 months.
Correct.
Damn.
That's insane, right? So like that, if you, and they're much more widespread, right? So it's not like 10 of these mollusks are way like more efficient than 10 of the other, but there's also just going to be way more of them too, right? There are way more of them. So by filtering the water and taking out any available food sources for other species within the water, right, it makes it really difficult for other things to survive. And it also it does a lot. Like zebra mussels also, like, they do some weird stuff. Like they make the water a lot clearer because they're filtering, which then increases the photic zone, which means you might have increased plant growth because the water is now clear. So like
then it like should normally be.
Than it would normally be, right? Because the mollusks there before were filtering at a much lower rate than zebra mussels.
So in this like world of, like you said, something that like I think is really, really smart about like the kind of like collision interaction between like infrastructure and like the natural environment and like what's going to happen. And so like the systems that we like use to manage our stuff, like whether it be like you're talking about like fertilizer for like agriculture, or like the removal and treatment of like waste and so on and so forth, like all of these things interact with the watershed because they are where we are, and like historically we are within like a watershed, I'm assuming because of like water being a power source at first, like millage things or whatever, that like at least on the East Coast, that like New York, like all the like Toledo, all these places are like on bodies of water. So there's like a lot of old or like America old places that are established like in the like meat of the watershed. So we have all these things like piled on top of each other, and like
correct, yes,
these are the kinds of things that you're talking about with like this like big kind of like collision of the two forces.
It's a ever going battle, I think, but I think we're starting to really like turn the corner and get smarter about it. It's just like we just need to kind of get everyone behind that,
I remember you like pointing towards something that's like happening right now back in Michigan, like something in that universe.
Yeah, I mean, we were having a conversation and about the lake back home that I would spend a lot of time at, and what they're trying to decide.
The one from your childhood that you were talking
about. My
about.
childhood best place ever. Yes. Yeah.
The place where your environmental journey began.
Truly, out on the lake. That was where I first ever knew of an invasive species. I mean, we had zebra mussels, and like they would cut your feet, and like I was like, what are these things? And it was like my first exposure to it. But yeah, and so they're trying to basically, there's sewer systems, right? And then there's like septics and like drainage fields. And this was an issue in Squam, and it's an issue like all over, is traditionally it's a lot easier and cheaper to have a septic tank, right? Where you go to the bathroom, all of your waste goes into a tank, and then there's a field where any like liquids are then like passed through it and back out into the environment. But the problem happens when these are located, close to water sources or a lake, because all of that excess nutrients is going to find its way into whatever water you're nearby. So and then those excess nutrients contribute to blue green algae and cyanobacteria. Like we were just camping in the Catskills and we couldn't swim, we couldn't fish in the lake because they had algae blooms, and I really was like wanted to, and my partner Grace had to hold me back from like asking the people at the park like, so what is going on with the septic system here? Like, because there's a bunch of bathrooms around, and like, are we just like going to the bathroom and then all the nutrients is going into the lake? Like, I was really curious to know like what's going on there. And so, like back home, they want to put in a sewer system, right? That would then send the water or send the waste elsewhere, and it would be processed and disposed of in an area. Even if sometimes they'll send it and they'll literally like spray it or like discharge it just farther away so that it's more distance between.
Just move it. Just like
move
legit move it.
Yeah, because then it, move it to the, a field near the woods or something so that plants around there can just take it up, and keep it out of the water. The problem is it's really expensive. And there are like other options, septic systems. I think there's sometimes looser regulations and inspections around them, and so they can go, unmaintained or not well maintained, and end up discharging more than they should, and contribute to high nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, fun stuff like that. And yeah, I mean, I saw the same thing in Squam, and you see it all over the place. And look, like we're right back to it, right? It's like infrastructure in nature. Like we want to live here and we want to like do our thing, but like we have to be conscious of like the impact it's having. Especially lake property around lakes is desirable, and they really pack people in there. And so like not being on a sewer, like that's a lot of people all around one area, and that's a lot of potential for nutrients to go into a water body. I read an interesting report one time talking about the idea of like a recreational carrying capacity, right? For like a lake or a river, and like how many people and how much activity should be going on in an area. And I think that can be like extrapolated and expanded to like not just water bodies, but like all kinds of things, right? And people do it already. Like in Squam, there was like really popular trailheads that they weren't gonna. I'm sorry if I'm like so off topic right now.
No, this is like I'm like this is very like doesn't the like the National Park Service does this in like some areas, right? Where they'll only like issue X amount of permits,
right,
like a day, or out of permits, like entrances into
correct,
like an area of the park for like a recreational thing.
Yeah.
And that has to do with this kind of stuff.
Right. Like they don't build parking lots bigger because they don't want more people parking there, because they don't want more people on the trails. They have to like keep it, keep the gates just slightly ajar. They can't fully, just like let everyone pour into an area, because, we tend to abuse things, unfortunately.
So, what about, like, how do I say, private land? So like, these are all like public spaces that we've kind of been talking about, but like private land. So like, there's you talking about like, how do I say, what are they called? Like septic tanks?
Yeah.
And like, so can people do, they can't just do like whatever they want necessarily, like on a body of water or something like that. Like, what does this whole like concept look like in the context of like private properties?
If I would think there would be a lot of rules and regulations and stipulations depending on what this water body is, right? If it leads to another source, then there's going to be more rules as if it's a contained pond on like a farmland, right? Like I don't really know a ton about like private land use restrictions and stuff like that. But I know that you certainly have quite a bit of freedom if you are a farmer with a pond, because those guys seem to just kind of do whatever they want. So, yeah, I don't really know. Oh, I'm blanking on which watershed it is, but I think it's Illinois area. It's I mean, it's the amount of phosphorus and nitrogen that are like going into those rivers because of those large scale farming operations is like crazy to think about. And especially poultry and chicken, they have like really, I think they say like chicken shit can grow grass on a rock. Like it is super rich in nutrients.
That's my favorite thing I've ever heard.
Yeah.
Chicken shit can grow grass on a rock. I
Yeah.
fucking love that.
Yeah. I heard that one time and I was like, that really says a lot, doesn't it?
So, okay. So now, so you're here in New York.
Yeah.
And you're kind of like living in this universe, question mark, of like still in this world of like shit got places it's not supposed to go.
In a sense now a little bit. You mean my current career?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't unfortunately get to deal with watershed science a ton. Maybe I'll find my way back there one day. I'm more into the soil remediation and like property investigation type of thing. Um, Still looking at like historical land use and infrastructure, which is super interesting. Um, New York is a bit of a mess sometimes, and you're like,
I can imagine.
Yeah, you're like, why is there historical fill, 8 feet deep? How did this get here? What was dug up and filled with, essentially like rubble, and then just forgotten about for years? But that's kind of stuff that we like come across sometimes, because a lot of New York's land is fill. Typically, we see like 2 or 3 feet of historic fill in places, and then underneath that would be like native soil. So when you go to, let's say you want to build a building, you have to comply with certain rules and regulations set out by the state and the federal government. And it comes down to more like human health. So within this fill is different contaminants, especially if the land use made that situation worse, like it was an auto body shop or a gas station where like things were being handled that were toxic and got into the ground. But there's already a pretty good base of like contamination to begin with in a lot of places. So essentially, before you have to build, you have to remove said material. And I really enjoy it so far. It's cool. It's nice to see different areas, get to travel around a little bit, and it's kind of like a treasure hunt sometimes. Trying to find an underground storage tank or figure out what what could have happened in an area. So yeah,
That does kind of sound like fun, particularly in a place like New York when like the sky is the limit on what could have happened sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It could be literally anything at all.
Yes.
I was gonna like kind of go in this direction of like soil contamination, like water contamination, and like ask you about like super fun science. Is I remember like not too long ago, I mean New York City is like full of super fun sites. There's like a whole bunch of them.
Right.
And there was another one that just got added not too long ago that was, most of them I think are water related. There's like the Gowanus Canal, the like Newtown Creek, and like that is all of the I think a combination of all of those issues that we've talked about so far, like sewage, transportation, gas, like all kinds of wonderful sludgy things going into the water. And then there's this new one that just got added. I think it's in like Masbeth, Queens, or like somewhere in that area. And it's like, it's soil related because of like to be determined what happened, but there's like some sort of insane amount of like contamination that went in there. So like super funds, like that's, I don't know. That's just what that made me think of. It's not really a question. It's more just like this made me think about super funds.
I'm glad you didn't ask me anything too specific because I'm not super familiar with super funds, and that I just know that once it's designated a super fund, shit gets pretty real. Like that is a big
and like people are like held accountable or at
Well,
some degree, or
yeah, hopefully.
potentially, like,
Yeah.
who knows what really happens. But like my question, having made a statement about Superfund sites and so on
Okay.
and so forth, is that like based on like your, how do I say, based on like all of your like experience with dealing with like the interactions between like people and infrastructure and stuff, like toss in some like climate change like on top
Oh,
of all of that.
well,
So like,
that's always what it is, right? It's like you talk about these issues, and then you're like, and then climate change, and everything just gets worse. Like that's just the reality of the situation, right? So like, I'm trying to think of specifically things we've talked about that can relate back. More extreme rainfall events is going to be a huge issue. I think we're going to see a lot more flooding, and I think we're going to have to really beef up the infrastructure that we have, and definitely get smarter about how we're doing it. Right? I mean, we haven't really talked about stormwater a ton in New York City, but with so many impervious surfaces and such a collage and mismatch of like the if you just look at like a breakdown of New York and what's underneath, not only the road, right, but then we have pipes and subways and electrical lines, like it goes on and on and on. So like, any sort of intrusion of the water into the earth is just not going to happen. So pretty much everything that falls in New York City area has to be directed and dealt with by us instead of the natural systems at play. And it's really easy to overwhelm what we have now in terms of storm sewers and drainage. Yeah, I mean, we have a lot of old infrastructure with cracks and crevices, and it's not this smooth, because when things are new and they work how they're supposed to, right? Like the crown in a road is nice and kind of almost U-shaped, and it sends water out to the sides and channels it where it's supposed to go. But as things break down, it's not as direct of a route. And like you said, it's water can stick around for a long time in places, for sure.
yeah. And so like the how do I say, the like water treatment issue in like these areas, or like issue, I guess it's like already an issue, because like combined sewer overflow like events, those they
Yeah.
happen. And here like the water like doesn't come from where we are immediately. It comes from like further upstate,
Mm-hmm.
and it's like brought in here through like an aquifer, but that's not the case for everybody. So like when we have these like overflow events where like you're talking about the like overwhelming of the system as it's like designed its
Right.
capacity, that it like just dumps into what is also potentially the like freshwater drinking source for the same area that like it's dumping from.
I think the issue with the combined sewer overflow is kind of like a double-edged sword, because it's like, I think it's something like 60% of New York City's stormwater is combined with sewer. And in one sense, it's like, okay, if the capacity is there to handle all of it, like it's great that like we're not just immediately flushing stormwater right into the surrounding areas of like water, because they'll pick up pollutants and trash on the way. But on the other sense, yeah, it's really easy for us to overwhelm them and then pollute the very waters that we are like surrounded by with fecal matter. Um,
Yeah.
and that, I mean, yeah, one of the, I think, reasons New York throughout history has been livable and successful is, like you said, they're able to get water from upstate, and hold it in reservoirs. And that's another conversation about like manipulating the landscape and infrastructure versus nature, right? Like we've turned rivers into lakes by damming them. And it's the same thing if you go back to climate change, like the variability in available water will change with heavy rainfall events and then a period of drought. It's going to be harder to predict when we'll have water.
The thing that always strikes me about all of this, like all of these issues like relating to water and like moving it, storing it, how we're using it, and how it's like affecting water. That like to me, I've always seen these things, or always viewed these things from like the light of like that's like freshwater is like one of the most scarce resources like in the world, and it's the most required. Like you need to have it the end. And uh the way that we interact with it often feels like in like
Ryan,
crazy to me. And like how
we need golf courses in the desert. Don't you know this?
I
We
know
need
it's
green grass
yeah.
in the
And
West. Come
yeah.
on.
And like the like I remember seeing this like article about, or I don't remember if it was an article or if it was like one of those like town hall things that got put out on the internet or something like that, about how like this it was this person either speaking or writing about like where they live in the like in the Midwest someplace, and how like the way that the watersheds are like shaped, and how like things, I feel like it wasn't the Midwest. I think it was like the West somewhere, like the Colorado River
Yeah.
watershed, like
I mean,
that whole
within that,
area.
there is
And
so many
that
little watersheds, right? So it's like, yeah.
yeah, and that like way up at like the beginning area of it, the is where this town was that was having this conversation, or like making this criticism about like water usage, and how they utilize a whole bunch of this water down in like Arizona or something, and they grow like lettuce there and then ship it to this place like further north where they like can grow the lettuce, but like they like don't have enough, like there's like this water issue up there with like something along the lines of like we don't have the ability to use like enough water here for irrigation to grow lettuce, because we're growing lettuce like in the desert in Arizona, that we then have to like buy it and like send it back up here. I feel like it was probably a farm person who was having this
Yeah.
conversation, but like it was just like one of those things where, you know, like the way that we approach like water management to me is just like crazy so often.
Yeah.
And like it's such like a scarce resource that it's like it starts to like worry
Yeah,
me
absolutely.
how we like treat it, and like the Great Lakes particularly, because it's like, at least to my understanding, it's like one of the biggest like freshwater reserves that
Yes.
there is, that's like accessible because it's not like frozen in a
Yeah.
glacier somewhere. That like, and like some of them are so polluted in spots where it's like you like can't, you have to bring water from other places, like what's it,
Yeah.
Flint, but that's like a river, but same thing. And now like in like Mississippi, and that there's like all of these like water issues that are like rooted in a lot of the stuff that you're talking about, like failing
Right.
infrastructure slash the way that we like have decided to interact with these
Yeah.
systems, and that they're crazy.
I mean, yeah. To me, I think it is upsetting for sure, and I think it's the biggest issue is just to me. I think it's a failure on the federal government, because a lot of these water sources, like the Colorado River, like I think it's 5 or 7 states that use the Colorado River as, you know, drinking or agricultural or whatever. They use the water from that river, and like no one is really on the same page. And like the role of the federal government to me would be to get everyone on the same page, whether they like it or not. And there's a lot of really like for as long as I can remember, I feel like the Colorado River has been, like, we all know that it's not sustainable what we're doing, and yet we just continue to do it, like day after day, week after week, month after month. Like,
does it even make it all the way to the
no,
ocean anymore?
they one time in like 2014, they like I don't remember who, like naturally put in water somewhere to get it all the way there, and then like studied the effects. That's probably it sounded really interesting, but I didn't end up digging more into it when I read it. But no, it doesn't make it there anymore. I know like farmers, it's kind of like when you in like a business have like you have like a surplus and you have to spend it all or else you're not going to get that money the next year. It's the same thing with the water. So the farmers have to use X amount of water or they will not be allotted the same amount next year. So they will use it extremely in order
Gotcha.
to secure.
So it's like encouraging like poor
Yeah, absolutely.
usage
And it's like,
just to be able to keep
yeah,
having access
yeah.
to
And
it.
like, I think, it's stupid. Like, I just don't know why we can't get this figured out. Like, it's so frustrating. And it's just the tragedy of the commons, right? Like, this is just like, at the end of the day, over and over again, it's just nothing really seems to change. And the federal government has to step in. It's definitely an issue.
So riddle me this. What do you think like is the role or should be the role of like individuals in all of this? That like so like
Right.
you and me are talking and feel a certain type of way that like perhaps other people feel a certain type of way or like like live near a place that's shitty or like having a messed up thing happen to it or
Jackson.
or is really really nice and wonderful and beautiful and like they want to like keep it that way. So like what is the role, like what do you think is the role of the individual in like these different types of scenarios, and like how can people more like responsibly engage in or like take responsibility for or whatever with like these spaces and systems?
I mean, it's tough, and it's the same thing I think with fighting climate change in that it's frustrating to be like having corporations or the man whoever tell you that you need to do a better job, right? You need to shower less and you need to whatever, however you want to conserve water. And then, the golf course is, having nice green grass to play golf on. But I don't think that as an individual, you still shouldn't make those efforts. I just think that you need to also hold the powers that be accountable. Um, Obviously vote, but I think we're in a bit of a pickle in this country with our political system. But I mean, still make your voice heard for sure. Make these small individual efforts because don't drive yourself crazy. I feel like some people, and even myself, can like go a little bit crazy with like the using, like be smart about it, but like don't kill yourself trying to like be the greenest person ever to possibly ever walk the earth. Like you are a human and you're allowed to like struggle or like buy a water bottle from a place because you're thirsty from Nestle. Like if you have to do it, it's okay, but like try to not and like make your best effort. But then at the same time, like hold everyone else accountable.
So riddle me this. If I'm listening to this right now and I am, my curiosity has been like sparked by this conversation and like everything that you kind of have had to say in this universe, like what are the things that you would tell somebody are the kinds of questions that they should be asking, and what are the kinds of like assumptions that people have likely encountered or have that they need to let go of to make like headway in this in progress in this?
I mean, first of all, if anybody is listening and is curious, you can send me an email. Peter M. Rathsack, Rathsack @gmail.com. Shoot me an email. We can have a conversation. I'll send you some links to some stuff. I think try and change, like, think about next time you're out for a walk or a drive or something, try and like think about the lens in which you're like perceiving your environment and like think back to like this conversation about like any piece of it, like the way water might move through an area. Like that is kind of how like my brain is wired. Like I'll go for a walk somewhere and like notice like erosion somewhere, or like I'm sure you do this too, Ryan, where you like see certain plants in certain places. Like I think try and like just think about like the perspective in which you're viewing things and like how you can look at it differently. It doesn't have to be the way you live your life all the time, but put some energy and thought into like the built environment and like this whole infrastructure versus nature thing and how it could be different, because we could definitely be doing things differently if we could get more people on board.